Well, good afternoon and good evening, CNY Nation. I'm Dr. Randy Fink from CNY Fertility, Colorado, and we are so happy to have you joining us today on what promises to be a very, very cold week, I think, in these United States as we approach the Christmas time holiday. And happy holidays to all of you, to you and your families. We're so glad to have you here with us this afternoon and this evening, whether you're on the East Coast or the West Coast or somewhere in between. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of important things, and I should have a special guest joining me in a little bit. But today, I'd really like to talk about the emotions of fertility and the things that both help us along and stand in our way on this journey, those obstacles that we have to overcome, the very races that we have to run to get where we want to be. So we'll talk about that today, and hopefully have some of your ideas, your suggestions, and your questions. So feel free to talk to us here on our Facebook and YouTube Live. The first thing I'd like to talk about is a question that came in from one of our viewers who could not be with us today. And that's just a straightforward fertility question. And that is, what is reciprocal IVF? That may be a term that you've heard about before. And so I'd like to tell you what it is if you're not familiar. Reciprocal IVF is for female same-sex couples. And in reciprocal IVF, one member of the couple provides her eggs and goes through the IVF process. We retrieve the eggs. The eggs go to our laboratory where sperm is introduced to the egg. Typically, it's a donor sperm. That donor sperm oftentimes comes from one of the commercial banks. Sometimes it can come from a known donor, but the eggs are fertilized, embryos are made, and then those embryos are placed back into the other partner. So that's what reciprocal IVF is, and it's something that we're able to do very easily, a very straightforward process to help same-sex couples join the ranks of having a family. Hi, Amber. Glad to have you here with us today, back in the good old Kentucky. Always a pleasure to have you with us here. As we start talking a little bit more about the emotions of fertility, I'd like to ask a good friend of mine to join here. And Danielle, welcome to our broadcast today. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little about who you are and why in heaven's name would I have wanted to have you on this broadcast?
Thanks. Well, thanks for having me. I'm Danielle. I am the director of our patient support program at CNY Fertility. My background is as a marriage and family therapist. I've been with CNY for at least a few years now. Our patient support program was something that kind of was born out of a need that had been there for a long time, but definitely during COVID, it became very clear to us and to Dr. Kiltz that we needed to have more dedicated support. So we kind of meet people where they are emotionally, mentally, spiritually on this path and provide different avenues of support.
Well, so what do you think is what do most of our fertility clients have in common when it comes to emotional needs during this time?
I mean, I guess there's a kind of a spectrum, of course, because everyone has a slightly different kind of constellation of factors coming into it. I think so much of it is being in the uncertainty and the unknown, and kind of how we're able to walk through that or walk down that path of uncertainty. I so much of it is like managing the expectations around that, and and like people kind of moving into a place of, we've talked about this, but of fear or anxiety or wanting to control an outcome. So those are some of the things that I see often.
Do you
Yeah.
think is it more a question about anxiety? Well, how would you differ anxiety from depression?
Mm. Yeah, so it's interesting. There's different thoughts on anxiety and depression. Some people say that actually anxiety is like a first, like, kind of, if there's like a trajectory that you might like start with anxiety and then move towards depression, because depression can be seen as kind of a certain kind of resignation after a certain level of anxiety. Anyway, different schools of thoughts on that, but um, we see anxiety, that's a lot of like kind of rumination, lots of like thinking, overthinking, repetitive thinking. You might experience it in your body, like kind of heart racing, um, just like a stressful feeling. Whereas depression is kind of there's like a lower energetic quality to it. There can be kind of a feeling of being kind of disconnected, shutting down, isolating, not sharing, kind of. So there's,
Feeling more withdrawn, in other words.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, so let's start with talking about anxiety because it is such a pervasive theme, I think, in our
Mhm.
fertility world. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that having a baby is supposed to be so easy. Would you agree?
Supposed to, yeah, sure.
Well, and when it's not easy, it creates an angst, I think. And I believe that I've heard it described before that anxiety is fear about the future, whereas depression, in
Mhm.
many cases, is ruminations on the past.
Mhm.
So that fear about the future and that anxiety, I believe, is something that we're hardwired for as humans. Would you agree?
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And someone described anxiety in particular as it's almost like we have this, let's say, like an alarm clock or an alarm system in us, and like if there's something that's off, it's like that alarm starts to go off to let us know. And so in that way we're kind of working properly. But sometimes we get stuck into like an anxiety cycle or an anxiety loop where it's just constantly going off.
Well, you mentioned ruminations. And
Hmm.
ruminating is such an important feature of anxiety. And of course, that term comes from the way cows digest. They eat their grass and they bring their grass back up and they chew it again for a while and then they swallow it again and then they bring it back again and they swallow it again. So it's these thoughts that just keep coming back again and again and again. Is our mind trying to help us by giving us these ruminations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, and if we can kind of see it in that way, it can actually really, really, almost in a way, empower us again, because it is that, we live in a state of like constantly trying to survive. I mean, that's how we're wired as animals and as creatures. And so that kind of alarm system or that rumination is like helping us kind of, ideally, the idea is that it's like helping us make the best decisions possible, but it can get pushed into a state when there's like a constant unknown where our whole nervous system moves into like a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze, of activation, of being in that kind of sympathetic reaction. And I think sometimes in this fertility process, we can get stuck in that kind of reactivity.
Well, so it would make sense if we're walking down the street and a bear jumps out from behind the tree and says, "Arr," and our body says, "Whoa, I need to get away from here." That's fight or flight.
Mhm.
That kind of anxiety makes sense because it's protective. I
Mhm.
suspect that as we evolved over the millennia, uh, we didn't really have time. Our ancestors didn't have time to stop and really enjoy the smell
Mhm.
the flowers. They were busy watching for the saber-toothed tiger to attack them from the tree line, or the pterodactyl to swoop down and steal their baby, or the rival tribe to come and steal the food. This kind of anxiety, worry over those safety concerns was inherent to our very survival. But I think as our brains have evolved, we've stuck with a certain portion of the brain. It's the part that's called the amygdala,
Mhm.
um, is constantly monitoring for danger, even when danger may not be present. So is that overactive amygdala? You talked about that sympathetic overload. What's
Mhm.
happening in that situation when anxiety really gets the best of us?
Yeah, I mean, we get kind of you talked about the amygdala, it's like the most primitive part of our brain from what I understand, and it's like our reptilian brain, so we get stuck in that state, and and there's also we talked about fight, flight, and there's also freeze where we kind of dissociate or just kind of shut off. We actually don't even sometimes realize that we're living in a dissociated state because that constant feeling of anxiety is just so much that we kind of move into this kind of shut what appears as like a kind of a shut off. Um, but sorry, I'm like trying to. What was it? What was
No,
it?
you're right on it there. Well, we talk about again ruminations. What are the most common ruminations? What do our fertility patients think of? What are those thoughts that just keep coming back? Is it going to work? Is it going to work? Is it going to work?
Yeah. Is
Did
it going to work? What's wrong with me? What could I be doing differently? Sometimes it's like self blame. Sometimes there's a lot of external blame. Like if only I did this, or if I was on these meds, or if I did her protocol, or if the doctor da 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 da. So or my partner this and this and that. So we kind of notice that usually the way that we approach our fertility process and is often a microcosm of how we move through our lives in general when we get challenged. Like, do we internalize? Do we externalize? Do we move towards depression? Do we move towards anxiety? But I think a lot of it is like, is that fear of the unknown? Is it ever going to happen for me? Or there's something inherently, intrinsically wrong with me, or I screwed up, or lots of regrets of like, I should have done this earlier, I should have made different choices, or life is just so unfair. I always get, this, of course, this would happen to me. Lots of compare and despair, um, lots of comparing.
Well, let me ask you this, since we're talking about comparing. Does social media help or does it make things worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what that this is like such a huge question in our culture right now, and I think it can kind of go both ways depending on how we orient towards it. There's a I my experience, and this is just speaking from my experience and what I've witnessed, is that so often, so much of what's out there or where we go when we're activated and triggered is to a place where we are comparing ourselves to other people and or we're kind of like desperately seeking information that like whether it's medical information or otherwise that may not even directly apply to us and our bodies and our situation. So I think when we're like seeking out answers on social media from that place of activation, it's usually not going to be helpful. Of course, there's like really amazing communities and different things you can find through you know, the World Wide Web. But generally speaking, it can also, I think it can also perpetuate kind of a state of isolation because we feel like it's like almost the facade of connection, but it's like we're actually just like looking at things and we're not really connecting. And one of the greatest ways to actually regulate your nervous system and to move from that sympathetic fight, flight, or freeze into parasympathetic rest and digest is through like actual human connection, through touch, through sound, through like just being in a space with someone, even if that space is online, but like an actual connection versus, just reading or texting back and forth or looking at people's photos.
Sure. Hey, if you just joined us, you're with Danielle. Am I saying it right? Biratel. Thank
Mhm.
you. I'm Dr. Randy Fink at CNY Fertility, Colorado. You're at Fertility with Fink and Friends, and we're talking about the emotions of fertility now. And thanks to all you guys who are joining us. Ariel, thanks for your comment there, and we are praying for your miracle this time. Hey, here's a good question again
Mhm.
from Ariel, and that is, can I stay on my Zoloft for anxiety through the IVF process? And the answer to that is yes. I will say that in pregnancy, the SSRIs, that class of drug, has been very, very well studied. And in my opinion, when I was practicing as an obstetrician, I would say that the benefits of staying on the medications during the pregnancy exceed the very low theoretical risks. This class of drugs is one of the most prescribed class of drugs in all of our pharmacies, and especially in reproductive age women. So, if you're getting good results from your Zoloft, I would recommend certainly you stay on it through the IVF process. It should have no effect on egg quality or on the creation of embryos. So that's a great question, Ariel, and thank you very much for that. And Jamie, thanks for your comment about thanking us for sharing here. That's appreciated. CNY Nation, I'd like to know what you think. Does social media help you with that anxiety, or does it hurt? We certainly know the web is full of information. I've heard the web described as the world's biggest bathroom wall. So there's a lot of stuff out there that may not be entirely accurate, but sometimes being amongst people who are sharing the same kinds of experiences as you are can be helpful, but sometimes it also hurts. If you have some experience with that, we'd sure like to hear about it. Please feel free to share with us. Danielle, what are some tips for folks who are really consumed by that anxiety?
Yeah. So there's like a kind of, I think there's a multi-pronged approach that you can take. And one of the things I would say is a lot of this kind of somatic body-based regulation. So getting into your body, because when we get into that fight, flight, or freeze, or we're usually like disconnected from our physical experience. So that might be as simple as like take a walk. It might be like lay down and put your hand on your chest and your belly and like slow down. Or I often will have some people do like a 5 senses check-in where they're like looking for, like, let's say the color green in the room, and then they're breathing in and they're smelling like what is the scent, and they're touching the fabric, and they're just kind of like getting back into like an actual present tense state, because like you said, anxiety typically it's like exists in the future in our minds. So that's something. I love journaling. Journaling is something that people don't always love to do it, but I've read that it actually moves us into our prefrontal cortex, and so in that sense too, it can help move us out of that kind of primitive part of our brain where we're really in this fear state. And it's incredible. Like in support groups that we run at the Fertile Spirit, I'll give people journaling prompts, and they might start out at the beginning of, let's say we write for like 8 minutes, and it's just fear, 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 fear. By the time we get to the bottom of the page that they're writing on, it's like complete transformation. And in many ways, that's because they have shifted their brain state. Meditation is really helpful. And I understand that when people are going through this, it's like sometimes the last thing you want to do is the thing that's like the best for you, unfortunately. So, it's just, I think we all experience that in different ways. We know what we should eat or how we should exercise. But that's where I think also coming up with different touch points where you can have support and accountability are really important. And sometimes people have that in their friend group or in their family or with their partner, but often, it gets to the point where they might feel like they need additional support, and people who like have either gone through this themselves or people who are like really here specifically to support you with your fertility process.
So what is mindfulness?
Wow, on the spot. I mean, in my experience of mindfulness, it's about being aware of the presence of this moment and of our thinking, our thoughts. So it's actually, it's hard to give this language, but it's like becoming an observer of your own thinking.
There are exercises we can do to improve our mindfulness.
Yeah.
Is that a good tool for kind of being able to quiet some of the noise that's in our brains?
Yeah, it can be extraordinary. And I like to start with the body. So bringing our bodies, like with a body scan, or some people like yoga nidra, which can be really helpful for sleep, but it can also just be really helpful to ground you. So that can just start with we can become mindful in the moment by just like noticing the sensation, let's say, in the back of our neck in this moment, right? Can you notice what the back of your neck is? It tense? Is it loose? Can you feel the curve of your cervical spine? That's literally you're becoming mindful in this moment, and it's bringing you into the present. And if you kind of do an entire body scan, then your body starts to, we say land, and somatic experiencing, which is a modality for working this way, we say you start to land when we do that enough. And then it's almost at that point that we can move more into the thoughts, because the body has kind of softened and landed. We can start working with the thoughts and kind of start to see them more clearly.
Do you think much of that noise, I think it's probably a good description to think of it as noise, because
Mhm,
it's just a lot of racket that's going on in the brain.
mhm,
I think it's in large part the brain trying to justify its own existence by constantly warning us about things. It doesn't so much care, our brain, about whether we're comfortable. It's just trying to keep us safe, even though 99% of those things that we might be worrying about are not real and will never come to pass.
mhm.
Is that really just evolution that's trying to keep those things at the forefront of our minds? So, particularly with fertility, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. This isn't going to work for me.
Right. Well, going back to the kind of just human evolution. One thing that I learned years ago is that it actually, and I have to check my sources on this, but that we actually burn fewer calories when we, the brain burns, more calories than in any other organ, and that we actually burn fewer calories when we kind of think in terms of the negative, because when we think in terms of like the negative or something not happening, we actually cut off the vastness of options of like holding holding the complexity of all of the possibilities. So we're actually wired to kind of think negatively, just to kind of like hone in our thinking.
Hmm.
And I think I may, yeah, go ahead.
So you would say that we are wired to think negatively, that that's the normal human response, that optimism and feeling positive and reinforced about a process is not natural.
No, and that's why we have to work so hard to combat that. We are in so much of this, we're kind of like working in opposition to the way that we've been wired in our evolution. So yeah, we do. And that's why things like gratitude lists are like really effective, because it starts to again like shift that tendency to think in terms of the negative.
How interesting. Well, we talked about social media as
Mhm.
maybe not always being a helpful thing. Um, the other the other big, well, call it the elephant in the room, is family. We'd
Mm.
all like to think that our families are fully supportive of us, that they're there with us, uh, that they're able to help hold us upright when really what we want to do is fall. But
Mm.
it's not always true, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. And I think, even when there may be an intention for the family member to want to kind of support you, but as we all do, like we all have our limitations. So I think there's so often, whether it's friends or family, there's just such a lack of understanding of what it's like to kind of go through this.
Hmm.
It's just like a basic, I mean, I would say that's like number one. It's just like a basic lack of understanding. And even in an attempt to relate, sometimes a family member can kind of exacerbate the issue, um, because they're trying to relate to something that where it's people going through fertility treatments or wanting to get pregnant. Like it is really unique. It is a unique place to be in, and it's a unique thing to hold that experience and the uncertainty of it. And sometimes it can be even more triggering when someone tries to relate to it from an experience that's like it's just different.
So, really, it may be that people are trying to help, but they're just not coming across in the best way.
Yeah. They might not be coming across. And I think there's so often with family and friends, like there's a tendency to want to like fix it.
Mm.
How can I fix it? And it might not even be a stated intention, but there's that feeling of like, this person I care about is in pain and they're suffering. How can I fix it? And so often what we really need in this process and is to just have someone just like be with us in the uncertainty, because we have to hold the uncertainty. We can't fix it. We have to keep showing up for ourselves and keep putting one foot in front of the other. And this idea that there's some kind of like magical answer can feel kind of minimizing of what that experience really is. And that can be really frustrating and upsetting.
So I've heard you talk before about just holding a place,
Hmm.
being one who can listen, as opposed to one who needs to solve a problem. It's our human nature to want to solve a problem. I mean, I know from my perspective as a doctor, when someone tells me about the problem, I'm already thinking about, well, what can I do to fix it? How can I
Hmm.
help to heal this person? And sometimes I think you're right. It's really just being able to listen and help to understand where they're coming from. When a family member isn't doing that, how hard is it to address?
I mean, again, I think it really depends on, the situation with the family member. I think we have to know internally, uh, like what our boundaries are with our family. And I know with like the holidays coming up, sometimes people are going to maybe be with extended family, and there might be questions about what's going on. And there may be people in your life and your family or your friends where it's just an area. It's like, I'm not going to go there. Like that's, like I know kind of what I'm willing to share and what I'm not willing to share with certain people, and just to be really gentle with yourself and respectful of yourself and your own boundaries in this, and and just really consciously making those choices, especially going into like family gatherings and things like that. But there might be people in your life with whom you can say, hey, in the most, like as someone going through this, like in the most kind of vulnerable, loving way possible, like, this is really hard for me, and I understand that you're trying to help me and that you care about me. But the thing that like would just be the best is to like just listen. Like I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm open to, maybe you are open to their ideas or their suggestions, but like I've been trying everything, or I've been researching everything. Like this is hard. I just know that it's hard, and just kind of holding that space, with the person.
Well, and I think moms and dads and siblings are often the worst culprits there.
Hmm.
It's what parent doesn't want to protect their child, but sometimes that protection comes at a cost, at
Hmm.
at a cost of something that the child doesn't really want to purchase, if you will. And I think that may be even what we mean by families being needy, because they have their own agendas in having those conversations. Would you
Yeah.
agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially around the issue of fertility, or like, growing a family and having grandchildren or whatever it is. There's so much of people's own stuff that's attached to that. And I would also remind people going through this that, like, if it seems like a family member is triggering you, or that they're really triggered or activated by this, it often says just as much, if not more, about them and their stuff than it does about you. It can We can take it really personally, but often it's that person's ability to kind of navigate this, or cope or not cope with what's going on. I think it's also really important to not become we use this term often in family therapy, the identified patient in the family system, where like you're the one who's having the hard time, or like you're the one who's the problem, and it kind of just compounds the stress and the guilt or the shame or the whatever it is that we might already be feeling. And just to try to really keep perspective on, like, this is a moment in time, this is the thing I'm going through. It's not a referendum on who I am as a human being, or what my body is or isn't capable of. Like, this is where I am today, and like we have to work really hard going through this to kind of hold that for ourselves, so that we don't get caught in this kind of role in the family, where like somehow there's something wrong with us. Because so often it's like, oh, there must be something wrong with me. I always say, like, you're not pregnant until you are. You don't get pregnant until you are, and then you're pregnant. You can have more of a story about it than that, and think it's like there's something intrinsically wrong with you, or you can know that, like, you're not pregnant until you're pregnant, and then you're pregnant.
So it sounds like some effective solutions there are: one, drawing limits setting
Boundaries.
realistic limits to what you're willing to tolerate from people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would use the word boundaries. It's a very
Boundaries. Okay.
therapist word, but it's just a little gentler. But yeah, sure.
Okay.
Mhm.
And it sounds like also maybe trying to take a step back if you can, pull yourself out of that moment in order to really hear what that family member's needs are. Where are they coming from? Why are they sticking you with this
Mm,
fork?
mm,
What background do they have that's bringing
mm,
them to the table to have this
mhm.
conversation? Trying to see it from someone else's perspective, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do want to mention this is a great question that speaks to some of my expertise in sexual medicine about vulvodynia. For those who don't know, vulvodynia is a pain syndrome that can manifest in a number of different ways, but basically it's a vulvar pain syndrome. This can extend anywhere from what used to be called vulvar vestibulitis, which is usually an overreaction of nerves surrounding the opening of the vagina or the introitus. Sometimes vulvar vestibulitis would be chronically mistaken for an ongoing, never healing yeast infection.
Mm,
So the patient might come to me with a book of all the different times, the hundreds of times she was treated ineffectively for a yeast infection. And then when we examine her, we find that there's no yeast at all. The problem is the nerves around the opening think that there may be some yeast there. And so they continue to fire like there was some stimulus. The nerves are telling the brain something's going on when something isn't. So the question is, does anxiety contribute to this? And I think that's a hard question because um, anxiety and mood issues are certainly related to these type of gynecologic pain syndromes, but it's hard to know which came first, the chicken or the egg. Did the pain syndrome cause the anxiety? Did the anxiety contribute to the pain syndrome? Fortunately, in the hands of a good expert, there are really some very novel new solutions that we can offer for vulvar type pain syndromes.
mm,
Another type of vulvodynia is also what we'll call dyspareunia, which means painful sex, or vaginismus, which is where the muscles of the vagina actually, they'll, for lack of a better term, they'll slam closed when intercourse becomes, when intercourse gets near. And I would describe that as a situation. Well, does anxiety contribute to that? Well, certainly history can contribute to that. A history of trauma can make that sort of problem worse. But there's only so many times that I can poke you in the eye before your hand starts to flinch when you see my finger coming towards it. And you can extrapolate that to any other anatomic metaphor you'd like. But of course, the body is going to flinch when it knows it's going
mhm,
to receive pain.
mhm,
And that, in and of itself, can cause anxiety. Again, fortunately, there are some newer modalities that, in the hands of someone with experience in dealing with this problem, can really offer some lifetime solutions to something that previously would have really truly been debilitating. So, thank you so much for that question. I appreciate you contributing that. It's about a little bit after half past the hour here. You're with Fertility and with Fink and Friends, and I've got Danielle Biratella from the Fertile Spirit at CNY. I think a lot of people probably don't even know that CNY offers resources for dealing with the
mhm.
emotions of fertility. So tell us a little about that and about your program.
Yeah. So we started the program, I guess, about a year and a half ago. Just realizing there was clearly such a need to address mental and emotional health, people going through fertility treatments, and so I'm kind of like usually the first point of contact. I also, my background is as a marriage and family therapist, as I said, and so really just kind of connecting with people, kind of seeing where they're at in their process, what resources they may have already explored in terms of support, or what might be most beneficial for them. So we, beyond the conversations with me, we basically have kind of a really great small team of coaches who all have different specializations. So everything from marriage and family therapists to people who specialize in like health and nutrition. We have someone who does hypnotherapy for fertility. We have a prenatal and postpartum doula. So we're kind of trying to like meet everyone where they're at in the process. And people can do one-on-one coaching, or they can do couples coaching with anyone from our team. And then we also have Zoom support groups that meet like basically weekly. We're actually going to be expanding it in the new year. So those are facilitated by myself and one of our coaches. And it's a really nice small group. It feels really safe. We have kind of like ground rules for how we hold space for each other, really speaking from a place of personal experience, not giving advice, but really, really holding that space. And those groups range from Hope and Heal, which is kind of a traditional support group, to mindfulness, to we've done hypnotherapy groups, we've done health and wellness groups. We might start to bring in some moon circles and things like that, different workshops, self-massage for fertility. And then, we can also provide other resources or kind of lead people in the direction if they're really needing a therapist in person, let's say in their area. We can do our best to kind of help guide them towards a good resource for that.
So as we know, our CNY family comes from all over this great nation, and that's why I'm fond of calling it our CNY nation. Are people able to avail themselves of these resources via phone and internet? It
Yeah.
sounds like it's really not something for which you have to be one-on-one.
No, I mean, so all of our support groups are on Zoom, and there's like a registration link you can join. I think we've had people join from South America and from like Africa. I mean, we've had people join from everywhere. It's really amazing. And it's really amazing to connect with people from literally all over the world who are going through this, who felt so isolated and alone. It's like, oh, there's a lot of connection there. And then, the coaching sessions as well are online.
And so how do people find out more information about Fertile Spirit?
Yeah, so there's links through the CNY fertility website. I think it's under patient support, but you can also go to thefertilespirit.com for more info. We're kind of in the midst of revamping things a little bit, but you can get a bunch of info there. You can schedule a consultation call with me to kind of talk about where you're at, thefertilespirit.com. So yeah, I mean, lots of resources out there, and I'm hoping more and more people will really take advantage of what we have. It's, CNY has had these historically, we've had these Facebook groups that are kind of like they're part of CNY, they're connected to CNY, but they're not necessarily facilitated by our support program. And I know they've provided a lot of resources and information for people going through this. Our support program it's more hands-on. It's more, really dealing with the emotional aspect of it, and more kind of one-on-one, smaller groups, that kind of thing. So,
how about costs?
Yeah. So the Zoom support groups as of now are complimentary. They're free for our clients, which is great. And then the coaching, we are in the midst of maybe changing this a little bit, but basically you can do a 30-minute call for $50, and then it just kind of goes up from there, time-based. We like to kind of start off with a longer session just to get more of a history and do more of an intake, and then follow-ups. Generally they could be like 30-minute calls. Just to check in. Sometimes people like to, they know that they have treatments coming up and they want to we also have a package, so they could like get a package to kind of take them through that. Let's say they're doing IVF or retrieval or something like that. It can kind of like take them through the trajectory of that time.
Danielle, we've talked about anxiety. We've talked about those recurring thoughts and how they how they really try to govern us and rule us and control us as we try to get control over the whole process. We've
Mhm.
talked about social media, we've talked about family. In our last few minutes, let's talk a little bit about depression and about
Mm.
how depression manifests itself. And really, particularly, I think one of the two areas where I see it are in unsuccessful transfers, or in situations where egg retrievals result in results that are less than what was expected.
Mhm.
And certainly, and most profoundly, in pregnancy loss.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about some of our resources and how we can help folks through those difficult times.
Yeah. Um, so one of the first things that I encourage people to do is to actually feel their feelings. Because often when we move into like a depressive state, sometimes we can get cut off from our grief or our anger. So again, kind of going back to the body, I really encourage people to find a pathway to express, and sometimes that means like turning on music that just gets you every time, and like, or like letting your body move, or taking a shower, or in a safe way getting in a car where you feel like you can totally be by yourself and you can just lose it, like you're contained, you feel safe, or you feel um to really connect to those feelings, because that can help us move it through the body. Go ahead.
Does that mean give yourself permission to feel it?
Totally give yourself permission to feel it. I think sometimes people are afraid that if they feel it, then it's like more real or something. But it's actually like, especially with this, it's not just emotional, it's physical, it's all of it. Like we're holding all these hormones and these shifts in our bodies, and like we really do want to let it kind of move through us. And if you look at, animals animals, mammals will like shake, right, when they're releasing stress hormones, or you look at other cultures where people process grief like in their body, and it's one of the facets of our culture is that we kind of repress a lot of our feelings. So I would say to kind of to start there, and let yourself have that time. And then, there's some like really beautiful, especially if there's a loss. There's like some, you can kind of create a really beautiful ritual to around a loss. Like letter writing is a great thing. Going to a special place in nature and kind of creating your own ritual. I love poetry, music, things like that, to really honor it because it is real. So that feels really important. And then again, to work with a lot of our thinking where we get stuck into really negative thought patterns about things never working out for us. And to
Mhm.
sometimes what I'll have people I'll sometimes what I'll have people do is I'll have them write down all of their negative thoughts, and then I'll have them next to it in another column write down the exact opposite of that thought, the inverted thought. So if the thought was like, I'll never get pregnant, the inversion would be like, I will get pregnant. And then you can sit with, could that be as true or more true? What does it feel like to sit in that possibility for a moment of the opposite of your thought that you're so attached to? There's something wrong with me, right? There's something wrong with my body. Um, yeah.
And here's a good question: can depression by itself lead to the to an IVF cycle not working? And I don't know that we necessarily know the direct answer to that, but certainly there is a brain body connection. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking with Dr. Magarelli some number of months ago, and we were talking more about like stress and cortisol. And they had done a study that he referenced about that there was this, the people who were pregnant with higher levels of cortisol had like, or I guess they were trying to get pregnant, had like lower levels of success in their pregnancy. And I mean, it makes sense, right? Like how we've adapted over time, going back to this kind of, our wiring as creatures, as mammals, is like if we're in a state of uncertainty or fear, if you think about that in terms of our evolution, like our body is wise to not be as likely to get pregnant in a state like that, because we would think it's not safe for an infant or a newborn to be in an environment that's not safe. So we want to create safety in our bodies so that we can kind of increase our chances.
Well, you hit the nail on the head there with cortisol levels. So cortisol is our body's stress hormone. And as we're stressed, our cortisol level goes up. Those prolonged levels of cortisol elevation can affect us in negative ways. And that's probably the mechanism by which that brain, or certainly one of the mechanisms by which that brain body connection of stress, anxiety, and depression can affect our outcomes. I want to close it up here with a nod to Lola, and thanks so much for sharing kind of what you're going through there, Lola. And that is, Lola had an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy in her fallopian tube. It sounds like by the time that pregnancy was diagnosed, there was already a heartbeat in the tube. And that means that the pregnancy has to end. The tube has to be removed because as the pregnancy will grow, it will rupture the tube and can be a cause of mom's death. So that's really a question of who's going to survive this, mom or baby. And unfortunately, in that situation, baby wouldn't survive it either. But that act of having to end a pregnancy with a heartbeat is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking in any regard, even when those who have to choose to end a pregnancy under other circumstances. It's a wound that will always be there. It sounds like Lola's dealing with guilt, and I appreciate it, Lola, that you acknowledge that it's irrational guilt, but it's guilt nevertheless. Danielle, what are your thoughts?
Well, first, I just want to say I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, and it is a lot to hold. And a lot of this also comes down to our our spiritual beliefs or what they might be. But there's this, again, like I would just honoring that was a pregnancy, and that was real for you, and like finding a way to actually hold it and to honor it and to grieve it. And it's just this, like, it's like the great unknown and uncertainty of life. And it's like, how do we want to navigate that? Because we don't ultimately have the answers for everything. It's kind of like, I always say, where I live, I can see the ocean. And so there's lots of surfers around here. And I'm like, how do we want to surf through our lives? Because there's inevitably going to be a big storm and a lot of crazy waves. And it's like, how do we want to move through it? And so much of it is the narrative and the story that we tell about what's happening to ourselves, to us, and to the things, and what's happening in our lives. Like, how do we want to frame it? So much of life is, how do we frame the things that are happening? And I think that, like, this whole process can either can really be an opportunity for us to kind of have an incredible wisdom and depth and understanding, and capacity to kind of surf these waves, and to know that, like, life isn't necessarily straightforward and it's not easy, but it doesn't mean it's not beautiful, and it doesn't mean it's not full of miracles and possibilities, and love, and also grief. And it's like, that's the thing. It's like holding the all of it. Holding the all of it is like, that's kind of our work as human beings. And if that means that there's like a soul out there that didn't come through this time around, we don't, there might be a greater wisdom in that we can't know. And it's our work to just kind of tend to ourselves and those we love, and to stay open, to stay curious.
Well, and I believed we're not really around here for all that long. And so to try to appreciate the little things that we do have makes a difference. It certainly makes a difference in my life. And gosh, Danielle, it's made a difference, I think, in everyone who could be with us today to have you here and talk about these things. These are such important things to talk about, and they're topics that are so often not spoken about. Well, at CNY, we want you to know you're important to us. your feelings are important. Your family is important. Here at CNY Colorado, we love for you to be the most important people in our world every single day, and in the CNY system across the nation. We are really committed to your family. Please look at thefertilespirit.com and take a look at the CNY website to learn more about Danielle and the program with the Fertile Spirit. Danielle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Fink. I really appreciate it. And yeah, just wishing everyone out there a really special holiday time, and just make sure you take time to also take care of yourself through this, because it's super important.
Indeed. And happy holidays to everyone. We're approaching, we're just past the 50-minute mark here. So we're going to wrap up Fertility with Fink and Friends for today. Next week, I'm going to be on vacation, so I will not be here next week, but please plan to join us on Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. That's 6 p.m. Eastern in that first week of January, as we address your questions and concerns, talking about all that's important to you. And God bless everybody. Have a wonderful, happy holiday, happy new year. And thanks again so much for being with us.
Bye.
Bye.